This podcast is sponsored by the Watts Hampton Cove, a brand new luxury apartment community located in beautiful Hampton Cove. The Watts offers 1, 2, and 3 bedroom apartment homes with stylish finishes and thoughtfully designed amenities. A short 15-minute drive from downtown Huntsville, the Watts offers unique features such as direct connectivity to Hayes Nature Preserve, over 10 miles of walking trails, Flint River access, mountain views, a large saltwater pool, dog park, dog spa, a 24-hour fitness studio, and more. Dwell in delight this new year and make the Watts your home. For the month of January, they're going to be offering a $25 Amazon gift card for anyone that tours and mentions the Beyond Rockets podcast. Learn more and schedule your tour today at livethewatts.com, and this information will be in the episode notes. Welcome back to another episode of Beyond Rockets. Today I sit down and talk with Dennis Madsen, Manager of Long Range and Urban Planning for the City of Huntsville. First off, thank you for joining me today. I'm excited to talk a little bit about Huntsville, the future, the present, and everything in between. Before we get started talking about Huntsville and what it is that you do, I want to talk a little bit and address a little bit of your background prior to coming here in 2013. So where are you originally from and what brought you here in 2013?
Sure. No, thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here. I could talk about Huntsville stuff all day long, but I was originally, my family's all from the Northeast, and we moved around a lot when I was a kid. I ended up in Atlanta for graduate school at Georgia Tech, studying architecture, but there was a lot of overlap in that program with urban planning. And met my wife in Atlanta and had a really nice career working first for architecture firms and then for planning firms. At a certain point, my wife, being from Huntsville, said, I want to move back to Huntsville. I need you to figure out what you can do when we move to Huntsville. I was just lucky, really, that Mayor Battle, who had been elected, I think, back in 2007, was really looking to kind of change the approach for how Huntsville was growing, recognizing that it was going to continue to grow, recognizing that it was going to really be a destination. He wanted to grow a little bit more intelligently and a little bit more thoughtfully. And a lot of my background in Atlanta working in planning was for communities that were trying to take a longer look at how they grew, trying to make it a little bit more community oriented so that folks, had an input in terms of how their community grew. That's an important part of it. And that was something I think the mayor was really keen on as well, was having a little bit more public engagement around how the city was going to grow.
Yeah. I mean, I guess in 2013, Huntsville looked a lot different than what it looks like today. Were you excited to come back to Huntsville? I mean, it seemed like Atlanta's a much bigger city. I mean, growing up probably in different bigger cities, you have like an English degree, I think, from Massachusetts, I think, and then your architecture degree from Georgia Tech. I mean, were you excited to move back to Huntsville? Like excited for the potential of like, oh, it's a smaller town? Or were you like, maybe we can find somewhere else?
No, that's a really good question, because I think there are things I miss about Atlanta. Atlanta had fantastic culture, great restaurant scene. The Beltline was just starting to come online. One of the most really fascinating public projects really ever done in the Southeast. Incredibly impactful. A lot going on. But my wife and I had a young son. It was getting increasingly difficult to navigate the city. If you wanted to go on a hike or if you wanted to go to a park, it could be 45 minutes in the car just to get where you were going. And if your friend wants to, if your son wants to have a play date with a friend, that's a half an hour drive. I mean, everything was just, you were in the car all the time. And one of the things that we struggle with is it didn't look like it was getting any better. In 2012, Atlanta had this T-SPLOST vote. They had identified all these projects that were going to help sustainable transportation around the metro. And the communities all passed it on a kind of executive level, and then it went out to the voters, and it lost at the ballot box. Wow. And we just sort of looked at each other and went, it's never going to get better here. And
it's just gotten bigger and bigger.
It has.
I mean, I don't think,
really
I think your 30-minute drives are probably more like an hour and a half probably now.
Yeah. The joke, the meme out there is that Atlanta is an hour from Atlanta. And that we used to say Friday morning rush hour starts Thursday afternoon. I mean, it was a constant crush. And I had been familiar enough with Huntsville because my wife was from here. We would come back. Her parents and one of her siblings was still here. And so we would come back and see them. And I really got to like it. And so, I joke about her saying, I'm forcing us to move to Huntsville. I really didn't fight it that hard.
Yeah, you're yes.
I don't know that I fought it at all, actually. Very, very navigable city. There's a lot to like about it. Having a mayor who was interested in doing forward-thinking planning was another compelling piece. When the job description came out, I said, that's literally exactly what I do, and it's what I love. And from what I knew of the people, I knew they were very, very pragmatic. Like if you show folks, these are the policies that work, and this is where they work before, and this is how we can grow constructively. Folks go, yeah, okay, yeah, well, let's do that then, right? That's a great attitude. And there's also a sort of an optimism, because I'd worked in cities really all across the Southeast when I was in the private sector. And there would some you would go in and there was just kind of existing apathy and or cynicism. They would say, nothing's going to happen. It doesn't matter what we do here. It's just going to be the same old, same old. And if that's the attitude, then you're right. I mean, your plan's going to collect dust. Nothing's going to happen. And you're going to be left with development happening to you instead of in concert with what you want to see happen. And so there's a great mindset here, really good administration. I think the community sentiment in general has always been very constructive. And so I was really excited. I will say, for the first year I was here, I was like half an hour early to everything because I just assumed, I was like, I get in the car and it's 5 minutes there. I was like, oh, well, wow. All right, now what do I do?
Do I go to somewhere else? Like, and the local scene too at the time. I mean, now it's easy to say, oh, well, I'll just go to a coffee shop and I'll be there for 10 or 15 minutes. It's not a big deal if I'm a little early. And now it's like, at that time, it was probably like, there's really not really too much I could just, waste time at. Like I can't just go to this coffee shop that's like at Piper Leaf on Gates now. Like you couldn't just go there.
Nope.
And so it's interesting just to see, and I'm excited to talk a little bit about just that growth over the years. What really interested you the most in like getting your degrees that you did? Because I mean, from an English degree to an architecture degree to now doing what you do, what was kind of like your first exposure to saying, hey, I think I could do something like this? Or were you just interested in each step along the way? Like, I like this at that moment.
Right. When I was younger, I was always fascinated with architecture. I loved the study of it. I think when I was an undergrad, I wasn't really sure if that was what I wanted to settle on. So I just sort of thrashed around. I liked reading. So I ended up, I got close to the end of my 4 years at UMass. And I was like, well, what do I have enough credits for? So apparently I have an English degree. But I knew coming out, I was really interested in architecture, and Georgia Tech had this program where you could go in and get your master's without an undergrad. You would just have to spend a longer time doing it. And Georgia Tech had a really great, very sort of theoretically based program that had a lot of focus on urbanism and a lot of focus on city design and a lot of focus on context and a lot of focus on planning. And I had always kind of found that part compelling. When I would go to other cities, and I would love to see the public spaces. I would love to see the way streets were put together, the way neighborhoods kind of coalesced, what defined a character between one neighborhood and another. That always really kind of fascinated me. I love to travel to other cities just to be in those other cities and experience those other cities. And the more I got into that, the more I really started gravitating towards city planning. And I got really, really lucky that there was a couple of guys who had worked for the Olympics, kind of a parallel effort around the Olympics in Atlanta, and they started their own urban planning firm. And it's a small little group, and they just happened to be fishing around for an architect that they wanted to bring on board, and I ended up signing up with them, and it was great. I mean, I think 99% of what I know about planning and urban design, I learned from those two guys at that firm.
And so you were based out of Atlanta at that time. And so was it just Atlanta stuff you were doing, or were you doing stuff all over the Southeast?
Yeah, we worked across the Southeast. I worked from Virginia to Arkansas.
Wow.
We did work for, say, downtowns where you're helping to do downtown master plans or planning developments like, say, Village of Providence, doing those kinds of plan developments. We would do master plans for smaller communities. We worked for housing authorities. We worked for school boards, all kinds of things. And it was a great experience because you could see the diversity in communities around the country. The thing that I ended up not liking about it is there was a tendency to work for a community and you'd get so involved in it that you'd start to feel kind of emotionally invested, right? A great example was actually an Alabama project I did. I worked on the comp plan in Prattville, outside of Montgomery. And I remember the contract ran out and we had given our final deliverable and it was, the job was done. And I'm handing this thing over and I'm like, but I want to stay involved. I'm so excited. I like the people here. I like the community. I like the leadership. I like the plan. I want to keep going.
And then you're just on to the next project.
Yeah, it's on to the next project. So the other nice thing about coming to Huntsville was my job is basically to keep making my own community better, right? I mean, that's a dream job.
And you're able to see, you're living in the community, you're able to see the community
Right.
grow, and you've been here for, I guess you're celebrating 10 years this year,
Right.
At that position. And so I think, that's was there a lot of travel involved with the other job out of Atlanta?
Oh, yes.
And
yes.
I bet it was a nice, do you miss the travel, or are you excited to kind of be stationed?
I mean, it was nice when you got to go. If you got to go to some interesting communities, that was kind of fun.
Yeah.
I had never been to Arkansas before. Going to see, I spent some time in Fayetteville and Little Rock, really cool cities. But especially after we had our son, the travel started to wear on you a little bit. The communities were nice, but it is a lot of work living out of the suitcase. So it was kind of nice to come someplace where travel for me now is driving down to Ditto Landing or going out to Decatur. That's the extent of it.
So in 2013, when you came here in Huntsville, obviously it looked a lot different, and planning processes. There's projects that you were working on in 2013 that have probably just finished or have just finished in the last few years. What did the job look like at that time, and what were some of the big planning targets or projects that you were working on at that time?
Yeah, I think the first part of the job, really for the first 6 months, was I was in a listening phase, and that's not atypical in the planning process, especially for a city. Is regardless of my expertise, I'm never going to know as much about someone's city or their neighborhood or their local community as they are, the folks who live there, who work there, who have grown up there. So I spent a lot of time really just meeting as many folks as I could, going to as many community meetings as I could, gathering as much data as I could to kind of form a picture in my mind. And then what really came out of that is we said, okay, what we probably need to do is what's called a comprehensive plan. In some states, those are mandatory. Cities have to maintain comprehensive plans. In Alabama, it's not. It's very sort of however a city.
Was that shocking to you prior to coming here, or did you already know that?
I already knew it actually from working in Prattville. But it was interesting to see the city Huntsville size didn't have kind of a concrete plan written down where you could access it. It said, here are all our policies and here are our goals kind of written out, especially one that was growing that fast. So I said, all right, here's an opportunity for us to really kind of articulate how we want to grow and really engage in the community. So one of our first big things was developing the comp plan, and it's still online. Instead of going in one of those 3-ring binders, with a comp plan that no one reads, we really wanted to do an online document. So it's actually at bigpicturehuntsville.com, and we maintain that. We update it as new policies come along and as new planning efforts are completed. And the idea was to engage the community, and we did over more than 24 months, a range of public meetings, some large scale, some small scale, some neighborhood based, saying, what is it that you want to see as we grow? What are the important things that are out there? And you hear a lot about transportation. You want to make sure it's still an easy city to navigate. A lot of around amenities. We like where we live, we like where we work, but we want other stuff to do.
Some sort of entertainment scene.
Absolutely. The recreation scene in particular. A lot of pride around schools, probably more than most communities I've ever worked in. A real sort of identity around the schools, and I'm not talking Madsen City. I'm talking about Huntsville City as well. There's a real identity in people valuing the public schooling here, which caught me a little bit by surprise. How sort of vocal folks were around it, and what are things that the city can do, and what can planning do to help support the school system's mission. We heard a lot about diversifying the economy, right? The Arsenal is going to be the big employer for a long time, for the foreseeable future. And you're seeing diversification happening on the Arsenal, right? It's no longer just stuff that gets shot up into the air. It's also about, FBI, DOJ, DEA, I forget the number, but it's something like over 70 discrete federal agencies are on post. It's it's almost like a mini DC there. And that's intentional, right? If there's ever, an agency that ever gets, a reduction in funding, or one that is, phased out, well, you've got so much other stuff going on there that you don't run the risk of being bracked out of existence. But we're also looking at sort of off the Arsenal, how can we diversify our employment and our economy off post as well? And the mayor was always very keen to kind of grow that middle third of the wage spectrum. we had seen as we were doing our study a lot of growth at the top end, and actually a lot of growth and activity at the bottom third of the wage scale, but not a lot in the middle. So he started chasing industries like Facebook, like Mazda, like Polaris, like Amazon, where you don't necessarily need an advanced degree, or in many cases not even a 4-year degree, to go out and get a really good, well-paying job that provides you enough income to buy a home, to buy a car, to raise a family, to really kind of participate in the local economy. And that was very important to really kind of build out a broad and sustainable local economy. So really diversifying not just the employment, but the workforce. Another thing was changing the land use policy. And Huntsville's not alone in this. We were very much a sprawl-oriented city, right?
Okay.
People were getting out of downtown. The developments were always big shopping centers and big subdivisions and big office parks, right? Which basically mandate that you have to drive from one place to the other everywhere.
It's not a walking city.
Exactly. And so we, not only from a professional perspective, knowing that that's a difficult model to sustain, but we also heard it from the community. They wanted more walkable communities. They wanted bikeable communities. They wanted more greenways. They wanted more options in terms of how they navigated their community. And so we really sort of put into the policies, that's the direction we want to head. And then, we adopted it almost 5 years ago, the comp plan, and have been, kind of implementing those policies ever since.
So, I mean, it sounds like the first almost probably 3 years at your position were just creating the plan, hearing from the community, and then the last 5 years has been executing the plan.
Yeah, exactly. And what we see, and that's a really good way to put it, because the value of an online plan is we can constantly update. We can constantly course correct. We see it as not just a plan, but a tool that we can use for decision making. If there's an annexation coming in, if there's a transportation project we're considering, we can say, all right, how does this fit within our goals? How does this help us achieve the principles for quality growth that we want to see achieved in Huntsville? So yeah, we've been pushing forward that. We're kind of working through a 5-year assessment right now, maybe see if there are any kind of course corrections or updates we need to do. But we want to kind of continue pushing forward with that.
So I guess 2018 is when that comp plan really kind of started being executed. I mean, did you so I'm trying to think. It's hard. It's a little hard for me to think back because I've lived here my entire life. I've seen Huntsville grow. Graduated high school in 2017, and 2017 downtown really was not a place. Even it's not that far away. Like it just wasn't a place people really sought after to go. There was really there was entertainment, but there really wasn't. What were some of the first sort of areas? Because there's topics that I definitely want to address as far as some big developments that have happened. But downtown Huntsville, I think, is really a huge spike that I think has been a trickle effect to everything else around it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I think what we want to do is take a lot of lessons from things that work downtown can also work other places. One of the key pieces was the development of Downtown Huntsville, Inc. and the hiring of Chad Emerson, who actually came on board, I want to say 6 or 8 months after I did.
Okay.
Having a dedicated person getting up, rolling out of bed, thinking 24/7 about downtown development, engaging in kind of creative ways to get folks excited about downtown. That was easily one of the most important things that we could have done.
And did you see that sort of model working in other cities, and that's what you brought into Huntsville?
100%. I mean, I'd love to take credit for that idea. They were working on it in advance, but absolutely. I think, in Atlanta in particular, there are a series of what they call CIDs, or community improvement districts, that advocate for the interests of certain parts of Atlanta, downtown, midtown, Buckhead, perimeter, all have these CIDs that operate kind of as mini cities and advocate for and recruit for their areas. And that's a great practice. It adds a little bandwidth to the city. It also provides a little bit more localized expertise in terms of the challenges in particular neighborhoods. Again, my charge is thinking about the entire city. Over 222 square miles at this point. I am never going to know this entire city as well as someone who lives or works or does business in South Huntsville knows South Parkway. I'm never going to know Maston Lake Road as well as the folks who live and work and do business on Maston Lake Road. So having those kind of business relationships and those community organization relationships helps me do a better job serving the community. So yeah, DHI was kind of that first stone in the pond, and then you see South Huntsville, Maine. You see North Huntsville Business Association developing. You even see some more nascent organizations like Cove advocating for development out in the Cove area. Those are crucial, and we saw they worked very well in other communities that I managed to do work in. Definitely something we wanted to see duplicated here.
Yeah, I mean, because I guess 2016, there was the big, I think it was 2016 or 2017, there was the big revitalization of the Big Spring Park, where they kind of put a new trees there, made the area a little bit more inviting. And I think that at least brought more families to say, hey, I could see going to downtown with my family, walking around the park, than it was before. And then from there, you had trickle effects with the square, the entertainment districts, and all that is. But another area that's kind of been, I mean, it's seen a ton of just huge growth is Mid-City in that area out there. Talk a little bit about what that process looks like, because I mean, I guess that was probably something that was been in the works for, or at least a thought of for a lot longer than what we on the outside see.
Right. That was a very deliberate shift in land use policy and the way we approach things. And frankly, you know, talking a little out of school, it was when I kind of knew that we were really serious about this. You know, I can be crazy visionary, you know, city planner who comes in with these wacky ideas, and if the folks who implement it are like, that's a little off the, you're a little off the plane there. But that was when we really realized we were serious about really changing how we grow and being more intentional about how we grow. That was, you know, the old Madsen Square Mall was in its, you know, it was in its dotage, you know, it was clearly struggling. It wasn't the activity center that it used to be. Cities really around the country were struggling with that. You know, you may be familiar. There's a couple of websites out there dedicated towards dead malls, right? And they're all over the place. And you know, it's not necessarily the fault of any given community. A lot of times you see these things overbuilt, or buying habits change, and the malls are not nimble enough to respond. But the fact is, if you've got a big enough development like that, you can't let it crater. I mean, you could let it fall apart, but it ends up having sort of a fratricide effect. You know, it goes under, and it takes all the commercial around it with it, and sometimes takes the neighborhoods with it too. It can have a very, very poor effect and a blighting effect on the community all around it. And not even touching on the fact that we get a significant amount of tax revenue from that corridor. Yeah. And so seeing that kind of fall off is bad for city services as well. Now you've got less money for schools, you've got less money for police, you've got less money for all the things that the city's expected to do.
That area was really an area that wasn't really, like, since as you see the downfall of Madsen Square Mall, I mean, that area didn't really have anything else to start bringing it up. But then when I guess the end of that fall and the beginning of Mid-City, you saw more and more of the shopping centers along University just beginning to be revitalized themselves, having a new facade, looking a little bit nicer, looking a little bit better. And now it's hard to drive up and down the street without the traffic just being astronomically insane. And so it's an interesting dynamic. And I know, like, we're recording this on the 18th of January. I mean, Mid-City even has more announcements, more developments happening there. What was that like? How long does that process take from when you say, hey, this is going to be a really great idea, to that initial tearing down of Madsen Square Mall, and then the initial buildup of what Mid-City is today?
Right. Well, the demo, you know, doesn't take a whole lot of time. We moved very quickly on it. You know, credit in particular to, you know, I'm not just saying this because they're my bosses, but you know, if I had them as clients, I would say the same thing. You know, the mayor and director of urban development, Shane Davis, for moving really quickly on this once a decision was made. Don't let it languish. Don't let folks wonder what's going on. Make a decision, take that thing down, and tee it up for redevelopment. So the city became a partner in the redevelopment, you know, promising to install new infrastructure to support this new activity. But typically, you know, the tearing down is one thing. Rebuilding, especially in a way that doesn't feel too Disney-fied, right? You know, if it all kind of comes up, boom, you know, overnight, it feels a little bit sort of Potemkin Village.
Having the stages of it kind of gives it a little bit more of a excitement feel behind it.
Because that's how cities grow. I mean, you know, being a Huntsville native, you know, if you think about some of the roads that you travel a lot, what they looked like 5 years ago or 10 years ago, 20 years ago, those change. I mean, cities are almost sort of their own organisms, that they grow and they change, and they kind of slough off dead skin, for lack of a better term, or you know, get a little bit of a makeover here and there, and so they kind of morph over time. Having that happen at kind of a reasonable pace makes it feel much more natural. Plus, you know, from a practical standpoint, it's just hard to build out, you know, 6 city blocks in the span of 18 months. So we're lucky. We got a really good development partner in RCP. They've got some really smart folks working for them. They're doing a lot of heavy lifting and a lot of work on that. But that was very much the idea of take the lessons of a downtown, right, and start transferring them to other places. And, I know Mid-City is kind of one of the more popular topics, but really one of the first examples of that out of the ground and one of the most successful developments in Huntsville is just up the street at Villages of Providence.
Yeah.
One of our first sort of traditional new urbanist neighborhoods. And you think about that, they're going on 2 decades of development in terms of how they're growing. So
and they're still doing more and more
still
stuff.
Building, right? So these things are not quick. And in a way, that's a good thing, right? You're kind of growing incrementally. You're developing these communities intentionally, but they can develop their own kind of character over time. And I think that's crucial because you want these things to be sustainable. You don't want it to be kind of all feel like flavor of the day. And then 10 years from now, you look at it and you go, well, I can tell you exactly when that was built because it looks exactly like everything else that was built during that time. So you want it to have a little bit more of its own character. But the nice thing is you can now take kind of lessons from there and say, all right, how can we do this like at Hayes Farm on South Parkway? How can we do this in developments along the Meridian Corridor? How do you start creating what we call placemaking, right? Celebrate the character of an area, let it grow up and create more of a district over time. And that those are things that we can do really throughout the city.
I mean, is it strategic in placement of when projects are going to be announced to have some overlap so that if one, as one is in the lull of in between stages, this one is getting announced and this one's getting built up and they're having this excitement of Mid-City and then there's new excitements with Providence and they're kind of back and forth. Is that kind of strategic in y'all's game plan, or is it just happens because of construction?
Yeah, I think it just happens. I mean, so much of it depends on their timeline, how they're getting things financed, how they're getting things built. I try not to get overwhelmed about the news cycle because around here there is a whole lot happening. Now you even come back downtown and you've got the old Coke side and you've got the sites on St. Clair, and then we're getting the new City Hall, and we're currently working with the county to figure out what they can do with their old courthouse. So there's a ton of stuff going on. So there's sometimes I just have to turn off my feed because it seems like it's never stopping, and that's a good thing. I worked in a lot of communities when I was in the private sector where they were just struggling to tread water. It was really, how do you keep us from drowning? Growth is a good problem to have, but it is something that you do have to deal with, and you do, to use your word, you do have to be intentional about it. I mean, this has to be thoughtful. You have to be planning for it, and you have to be ready for it.
So I grew up in South Huntsville, and I think South Huntsville, from always the outskirts, was never people I always associate it with as a, this is where you live, this is not where you are entertained, and this is where you do anything like that. And the Hayes development, I mean, my wife works at that Publix, and so that development, I mean, it's really been the last 2.5, 3 years. Why does projects like that in an area that I think has the land, the potential, the growth, the demand, the people, take longer to be announced and longer to get a footing than areas such as downtown or Mid-City or Providence? Just because, like, on perspective, it's like this area has it. This area is ready for it, but it just didn't get there necessarily when the timing, I think, of other things were happening.
Right. I think a lot of times it's you have to hit kind of the right moment. There has to be a confluence of the market, because fluctuations in the retail or commercial market oftentimes can have a chilling effect on those sorts of developments where, someone's like, yay, we're going to get a grocery store here. And then all of a sudden that grocery store starts to struggle, or there's a national downturn, and then that project cools. You also have to have your landowners on the same page. I know for a long time, the old Hazelland Square was encumbered by certain agreements that made it kind of difficult to redevelop. You also have to have some of the property owners adjacent be willing to say, let's think about a different model for growth. And credit to the Hayes and Infinger families who really, they were actually kind of watching the comp plan and said, you keep talking about these mixed use centers, you keep talking about, live, work, connect, all these kind of things. Is that something you could see applicable here? And they were great. I mean, they worked with us. They worked with the city, said, would the city be willing to participate in this way or that way if we committed to doing this kind of development? And it's been a great process. I mean, the Publix in and of itself, the redevelopment of that shopping center is exciting, but I think the real meat and potatoes when the development is done is when you get a little farther back off of the Parkway, and they're creating almost another sort of village of Providence.
Because it'll have all like the apartments conjoined with
Yep.
retail, entertainment district, all that, and then it'll have all the multi-family homes kind of behind it,
Yep.
going along the greenway.
Yeah, and they'll have a little kind of town square, a new little park there, and then that starts to get connected into the Greenway network. That Greenway network eventually will connect all the way down to Ditto Landing. We've only got a few more phases in order to make that connection. That's a fantastic amenity. And if you think of the fact that you can go there, have a little coffee, get on your bike, ride down to Ditto.
And then from Ditto, you can take the other Greenway.
Yeah, then you can come up Aldrich Creek. And then, most folks in South Huntsville know we've improved almost all of the Weatherly Path. There's a little segment just on the west end connecting across to the Hazeland extension. So you end up with this fantastic loop where you can go Weatherly to the Grissom area, down that Greenway, down to Ditto, then pick up Aldrich Creek and come all the way back up. That's a fantastic amenity. Nothing like it around here. It's a great start. It's a great model. And again, that's a sort of kind of public and private development package where we're all thinking about how do we make better, more sustainable, more livable communities.
Yeah. I mean, like, how is that goal with that Publix and the Hayes development kind of that first initial push into the South Huntsville to then go and say, what could be done from here to Ditto now? I mean, a lot of people in Huntsville, I guess, would always say, like, I think there's a lot of area in Ditto that's underutilized. I mean, you've probably been hearing that since you came here in 2013.
Yes.
Is
yes. Even before that.
It's like, what are we going to do with Ditto Landing? What are we going to do with Ditto Landing? Is that, I mean, obviously there's some things you can talk about in the future, some things you can't. Is Ditto Landing a part of y'all's long-term plan in the next 5 years to get something more of a infrastructure behind what's like, say what they're doing in Gunnersville with the co-op and that sort of development?
I love that project.
Doing something like that, or doing something of entertainment at Ditto Landing that has such a huge potential.
Yeah, and that's a great question. That was actually one of the first kind of small area-specific plans that we did was done for Ditto. And that was one of those things. The reason I go places and I try to listen first rather than assume is because my assumption when I first moved here is no one cared about the river, right? It's all the way down there. There's, a couple of folks on boats and occasionally people go down there and hang out at the pavilion, but otherwise no one cares about it. Well, the more we reach out to the community, the more we realized folks were saying, hey, couldn't we get more out of the river? Couldn't we do more down there? How could we support Ditto and sort of becoming the next version of Ditto? So one of the first things we worked on actually was doing a master plan for Ditto Landing, which is it's actually on our comp plan website. It's already out of date because they've done so much. They're currently in an iteration where I think their board is trying to update that master plan and grow it even further. I think a lot of folks say, well, why can't we just do X, Y, and Z down there? There's one challenge that does have to be understood. That land was granted as part of an agreement, I want to say with the Federal Fish and Wildlife Agency.
Okay.
There are certain restrictions on what can and cannot be done there, and commercial use is heavily restricted on that side. So you could not come in and just, overnight do a top of the river kind of restaurant
development.
Right. So they're trying to get kind of a master plan that they could then say, all right, here's what we want to do. We're not over commercializing. We're still holding to the recreation mission, but I think you're right. I think you do want to introduce a little bit more activity down there. They have a really good executive director who was hired kind of on the heels of the master plan, the first master plan, Brandy Quick. She's grown a lot of the camping sites there. She's got some new facilities installed. She's already looking at kind of what the next stage is. How do you, how might you redo that pavilion? Because that pavilion it's not the most flexible facility, but you think about a ton of folks use it anyway. And it's because it's in such a great spot.
Oh, yeah.
And then the old state docks, that kind of metal building that's there. I know both Dr. Robinson and Phil Riddick, the city council person and the county commissioner for that district, have been looking at, how you could reuse that area, and they've both been working on that. So I think there's a lot coming. I think the Ditto 5 years from now will look very different than what it does today, but it's exactly what you're talking about. Creating another activity center. It's taking advantage of something we already have, right? You're not trying to invent something.
Yeah, we're not building a whole new riverside thing. I think that the legacy of what Ditto Landing is and just the reference. I mean, it's hard for someone, even if they're like, oh, I lived in Huntsville for a few years, and then you just meet them out and about. Oh, did you ever go to Ditto Landing? It's going to be like, okay, yeah, 100%. Like, I know Ditto Landing. And if you mention the Madsen Square Mall, I'd be like, oh, it's not there anymore. Yeah. And so it's just kind of those, like, there's those reference points that kind of starts Huntsville. Like, Ditto Landing is the start of Huntsville from Lacey Springs. Like, this is the start, and it goes all the way north, all the way west, east, whatever you want to say. So it's just interesting to see. What's also interesting, and I don't know how y'all are going to do it, and maybe it's just I just don't understand it. How is the Greenway going to go from Grissom to Ditto Landing? Because I've ran that Greenway and it stops right there at the gate for the Arsenal.
It does. We have we've got some. I think there's some easements a little bit farther south that we can work through.
Okay.
So we won't be on the Arsenal at all. We're going to kind of skirt the edge of it. Then there's some undeveloped land that we've already started working back from Ditto. So if you go down to Ditto, go across that old iron bridge and go along the river. We've got a greenway kind of packed in there now that starts to work its way north. So we're really working our way towards the middle from the north to the south. So yeah, we've got the route laid out. One of the things that we did do also coming out of the comp plan was, we heard over and over and over again, people love the greenways, love the greenways, love the greenways. Why aren't you building more of them? Build more, build them faster. So one of the things we did was we engaged with the Land Trust of North Alabama, who has a lot of experience in building out recreational paths like this. And we have a partnership agreement where they kind of help with the design and they help with the acquisition so we can get more greenways on the ground. So they've helped us really kind of map out what that looks like working over there. And they're helping us work through, the rest of the city as well. But they've been a great partner. And I think that's going to be, when we finally have that whole loop completed, that's going to be a fantastic piece. And then, it also plugs into that broader thing. I don't know if you've had Dr. Kavach with the Singing River Trail come in and talk about that project. That's sort of a North Alabama regional recreational trail that really stretches across most of North Alabama. If you think of like the Silver Comet in Georgia or the Chief Ladiga or the Natchez Trace, those sort of multi-county greenways, that's a very realistic project for North Alabama, and it would come right through Huntsville. And one of the main intersection points would be at Ditto Landing.
Wow. I mean, I think I also heard at one point, I don't know if this is still the case, but you were going to put a greenway kind of going off like where Burn is over on Pratt. There was there was at one point I saw it was a house that was actually listed that this is going to be a new greenway kind of connecting to where the dog park is. And over in that area, I don't know if that was a thought or if that wasn't, or if it's just fallacy. I don't know.
Well, we are doing some improvements up Meridian.
Okay.
And long term along Dallas, where you see a lot of that retention, we're looking at how we can improve that retention area because a lot of that floods.
Yeah.
And this is a great example of greenways kind of taking opportunities to kind of get inserted in places that might not be used for other things. Well, floodways, obviously, you can't build a whole lot. As we improve that area and kind of increase our flood mitigation, what's left over, we can run a greenway up there. So you can end up connecting that kind of area of Pratt all the way up to Oakwood. One of the next phases we're working on is connecting from downtown to A&M University as well. And we've got several segments in a variety of phases of development. So long term, we would love folks to be able to really navigate almost across the entire city via greenway if they so choose.
Wow. I mean, it sounds like greenways and entertainment districts are eventually going to be all over Huntsville, and there's going to be no shortage of the two.
Purple cups everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I'm okay with that. One thing that I think it's hard that everyone's going to be listening, that's going to be thinking about as we had this conversation, and we had a little bit of this conversation off air. One thing that's also hard to it's hard to miss when driving around Huntsville is just multi-use buildings, apartment buildings, supply versus demand. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think you had a good perspective off air before we got started about just kind of what that demand actually was and where it is now and why it is so important that we are doing this.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of it is everybody knows we're growing, right? We're adding hundreds of people a month. The growth rate's anywhere between 1.8 and 2% annually, which for a city our size is, we're adding a lot of people. You just need places for those folks to live. Apartments are a great way to accommodate that. Apartments are not having a whole lot of trouble getting financed, so that helps them get out of the ground. We have a lot of land that can readily accommodate apartments. And I would also say, similar to what we talked about earlier, I think the demand was under-met over the intervening decades. We were not building enough really to satisfy what we needed, and you're starting to see us play a little bit of catch-up. I think you're probably going to see it soften in the coming years, but you're still going to see apartment develop happening. There's still demand out there for it. Generally, if the banks are still giving money to it, they're doing their homework. They know there's still a market there for it. We have been focusing a lot on the idea of mixed-use buildings, depending on where they are and what their context is. The idea of having shops or offices below helps kind of activate that building. It can kind of create a better pedestrian environment. It can start creating more of a district, more of a neighborhood feel, especially in major corridors. So that, some of them you see are just, they're apartments 100%. Some of them are coming up as mixed use buildings. I think those are all great. Those are types that we need. I think they've been underbuilt here in the past, and we're still playing a little bit of catch up. But you go places like, Village of Providence, Mid-City, downtown, even the new development on Pratt in between Andrew Jackson and Meridian. Another great example, and that's going to be great because you're sort of adding more kind of restaurant and commercial space, which a lot of folks wanted to see filling in on Pratt. But with those apartments, you're also adding customers for those businesses, and that's the key thing is those folks are going to shop at the shops and they're going to eat at the restaurants. They're helping pump money into the economy, kind of keep the economy going. So, I think our development review will probably come out later this month, and that's my department publishes that annually. That kind of looks back over the previous year, how many homes were built and permitted, how many apartments were built and permitted, what our growth looked like. And this is actually, in talking with the gentleman in my office who does it, we think that this past year will have been the peak. Yeah, right? That'll be sort of max development that we saw,
and you'll see that over probably the next 2.5, 3 years that all of those will be finished, and then you'll start seeing. So I know, looking at the apartments, there's a lot of apartments that are. The Eclipse is finished, Constellation, I guess, finished, and you see this. You still see when do you think you'll see those apartments kind of being full or getting to higher capacity? Because if it feels like for on the outskirts, it's like these are finished, these are operating, these are ready to go, but they're not really full. But then we're building Lincoln Mill, we're building Pratt, we're building. You can't, like I said, you can't drive around Huntsville and not see it. You see this is the peak of development, and then we're going to see just the influx of still people coming in that's going to help support that.
Yeah, I don't see our population growth slowing down anytime soon. We still have a lot of FBI development coming, still a lot of industry coming around, especially out west and north. North Huntsville Business Industrial Park is growing. Most of the limestone development is growing. CRP is growing and redeveloping. There's so much influx of employment that people are following. So I don't see the need for residents slowing down anytime soon. I think, we had a real kind of peak in construction here. I think it may slow down a bit, but slow for us is fast for any place else.
And you mentioned a little bit earlier just of your time in Atlanta and just the traffic and just what that looked like. Oh, yeah. People listening to this too are going to say, hey, with this influx of people, influx of things, entertainment, whatever that might look like, traffic's just going to continue to get worse. Over the last 2 years, it's gotten harder and harder to drive. Luckily, I don't live far from my offices. My clients aren't far, so I don't really drive very much. Right. But what is your response on how traffic and how these roads will continue to be developed and sustain this growth that Huntsville's seeing?
That is absolutely one of my favorite questions, Stanford. I love that. Now, I will, oftentimes offer a little bit of a caveat. Having come from Atlanta and having worked in other cities, when I hear folks complain about traffic here, sometimes I have to say, all right,
it's not that bad.
However, yes. But, I also understand folks don't care. They're like, I don't live in Chattanooga. I don't live in Atlanta. I live here. Yeah. What are you doing about traffic here?
This is why I love Huntsville.
And I'm same way as I left that on purpose. I don't want to bring that with me. So there really kind of three things that you have to do kind of all in concert to ensure that your traffic stays sustainable, right? That you don't completely get kind of choked by your own growth. And those three things are varying your uses, varying your routes, and varying your modes. And you have to do all three of them. But when you do that, you can create a sustainable transportation network. And varying the uses, it goes a little bit to what we already talked about. Places like Village of Providence, places like Mid-City, places like downtown become more walkable, right? So you're already reducing traffic simply by not forcing folks to drive everywhere. Yeah. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to have a lot of folks who suddenly don't own a car and walk or bike everywhere, but you're providing folks more options and more transportation choice so that the trips they can choose to take by bike or by walking, they can do so. So that's one thing. But if you create more of those kinds of developments, now all of a sudden you have more of those activity centers that aren't reliant on driving. The second piece was varying routes. And another important part of creating a network that works is how resilient it is. And you want multiple ways to get from point A to point B. I will say, Huntsville as a metro has some really particular challenges that a lot of other communities don't face. One, we've got the river that forms a kind of hard southern border that's difficult to cross. We've got the mountains in the east, which there's really only so many ways you can get back and forth across those. And before anyone says, hey, Elon Musk has a thing that'll dig a tunnel, no. I've talked with a couple of folks in sort of on the geology side of this, and they said, based on the sort of way our geology, tunnels are not particularly easy or cheap. So we've got those mountains, and then you've got the arsenal, which is a huge employment center, but it's also restricted access. So you don't have a lot of free flow back and forth through the arsenal. So we've got these kind of constraints that can make moving people around our region a little bit difficult. Despite that, our traffic still moves pretty well. Mm-hmm. Part of that represents a really sustained investment in our roads over the last really 2 decades. And we put a lot of money in our roads and highways over the last few years, just on the state and federal level. Right now we have over $340 million in active and planned projects just in the Huntsville area. That's a lot of investment in roads, but one of the ways you make that work even better is you say, all right, let's start adding different ways to get places. So while we are doing things like, adding an overpass at Madsen Lake or widening Cecil-Ashburn, we're also doing the Northern Bypass. We're doing Resolute Way, which is a new interchange. We're adding Greenbrier Parkway. We're adding the Arsenal East Connector, which is kind of a parallel route to the Parkway. Those are things that give folks alternative routes to get from point A to point B. That helps accommodate more traffic. It gives you more options. If there's an accident on one road, now all of a sudden you've got other routes. That's a huge key to resiliency. And then the third thing you have to do is vary your modes. Now, anytime I go out and talk about this, I ask folks, all right, how many folks rode the bus here, right? Yeah. Weirdly, I never get any hands raised. However, that doesn't mean there isn't a lot of bus ridership. Every time we do an update on our transit study, our ridership increases. Wow. We have unmet demand out there. So one of the things we want to do is also focus on developing and enhancing our transit network. The key is, and I cannot say this, I cannot emphasize it enough, if you wait until you need transit to implement transit, it's too late. Yeah. It's going to be cost prohibitive. It's going to be impractical. So we're looking at how we can really ramp up our transit. A lot of folks are fascinated with the idea of light rail. That's probably a much longer term play because it's very expensive, not only to build, but also maintain. But there are a lot of ways that we can do kind of trolley type service that move folks faster, that provide folks, again, more options in terms of how they navigate their community, so that folks who maybe don't want to drive, or some folks age into not feeling as comfortable driving, they can move into areas that are more walkable. Yeah. And then they can also navigate more comfortable transit that gets them where they want to go. So, and doing better bike infrastructure and better walking infrastructure feeds into that as well, so that you're offering a whole lot more transportation choice for folks to navigate their community. Yeah, and I think that's one of the I think the positives of growing up here and living here. It's if I need to get someplace, I kind of know the back way to get to most places. So even if this road is, and there's most of the time I never get on 565 at rush hour, so I never really deal with traffic out there. Typically I'm out there at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, before the traffic gets there. But it is interesting to see, because that's a huge, you can't go around talking with people without talking about traffic in Huntsville. And this, when I lived in Atlanta, everybody hated Waze, because they're like, look, I had my own little secret route that nobody knew about. And now Waze tells everybody everything. And that was the joke was always when you're in Atlanta, one of your favorite topics of conversation at any party was, so what's your commute? If you're going from here to there, what's your favorite? Do you Krog Tunnel, or do you do DeKalb Avenue? Exactly which way do you go? And now, Waze has completely ruined that. Yeah, and moving forward too, and then just the development of what Huntsville is going to be and what Huntsville has been over the years is just the skyline of Huntsville is going to continue to change. Yeah. Coming into 565, you have the Constellation, which will be continue to be developed in addition to the apartments, but eventually that's going to be like a Bridge Street-esque, Providence-esque sort of place, I assume. And another big one they just announced that I would love to get your perspective on and just talk a little bit about is the Sky Bridge. Because it's going to go from 9th Avenue, I believe, to Holmes. It'll land roughly on Clinton, and
Okay.
it'll kind of take off in the Constellation area and go over the Parkway and Governor's Drive. It'll have one part that'll land kind of on the north of Governor's,
Okay.
and another part that'll land south of Governor's in the Low Mill area. And the idea is that's purely a bike and pedestrian bridge, and it was going to be costly enough that we weren't going to be able to do it locally. So we waited until we got a federal grant. So that is helping out with a good chunk of it. But it's also really two projects. There's the bridge piece is one, which connects, walkers and cyclists across the Parkway and Governors, which is a huge barrier if you're walking or biking. But it is also improving the creeks that run behind the BBC and the Coke site and creating more of almost kind of a San Antonio Riverwalk vibe behind there. So it's really two projects are all part of that. And the idea is, creating not only better bike ped connectivity, but just kind of better places. Like right now, I don't think a whole lot of folks go downtown to hang out next to that concrete culvert behind the BBC.
Really.
Doesn't really sing to you. But we know it can continue to do its important work, which is moving water through downtown. But if you redesign it, you can also create a place. You can create a place where people
and then
want to
greenways can be built from that.
Exactly.
You kind of have that whole infrastructure connected.
Exactly. It can become part of that broader network.
And then I want to say in that proposal or the stuff I've seen with the Sky Bridge is also the tallest building for Huntsville. Is it proposed?
Yeah.
Is like what does that look like?
That one, I don't know what kind of legs it has. That was the only article I saw on it. I know there's nothing in the city on it. Someone may have just been dreaming big and threw that out there to generate some excitement. The site he's talking about has some
Where's the site?
I want to say it's south of Governor's, not far from the Parkway. And I think it's at the confluence of two of the
bridges,
drainage.
Okay.
Two of the culverts, so
yes.
they're coming together. So it was a little bit of a
kind of like across from Low Mill.
site.
There's that one,
Yeah.
and then it's kind of sits right there. Okay.
Well, and I think most folks know, it's easier to do a rendering than it is to do a building. So in most cases, if you really want to know something serious, wait until they start moving dirt.
Yeah. And I know that I feel like that's probably a huge process too. Is that strategy of announcing it before actually breaking ground? Because you hate. I mean, I know with Constellation, the sign went up probably 4 or 5 years ago, and they just opened a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
And so is that a lot of the planning and the long-term planning behind projects too, is to say, when do you announce this versus when do you break ground versus when is it? Because you'd hate to present something to the public and then it not happen in the time that they think it should.
Well, it's easy on our side because we just sort of lay the groundwork. Here's what it's zoned. Here's the city participation. That's when you start getting on the private sector side, and those are the folks who have to navigate it. Folks like Scott McLean, folks like RCP, folks like Enfinger doing their developments. These are long plays, right? The Slimans again have been in Providence for 20 years now, and over a course of 2 decades, the economy is going to cycle up and down.
Yeah.
You're going to hit dips where it's a little harder to get money. So that project that we just announced, all of a sudden things cooled. We're going to have to sit on that for another 12 months.
Yeah,
that just happens. One of the interesting things that I think is compelling about Mid-City, and one of the things that they did really well strategically, was they did the camp on site right from the get-go, right? So they actually have something to announce that they then built that was drawing people there even before there was anything else on that site. So it was a nice way to kind of announce and commit without people going, well, where is everything? It was that little first step. It was that little stone in the water that started the ripples that then gave them time to then, all right, here's our next piece. And then here's our next piece.
It gets people used to coming to that area.
Bingo.
Because I
Bingo.
mean, I think that's the big thing that I always wonder about is these new developments are fantastic. They're great. They're in areas that really need it. They're in areas that are underutilized, underdeveloped, but maybe in areas that could really gain from this. I mean, the Hayes development, all that sort of stuff. But when you have that first sort of, hey, here's our centerpiece. It's Publix for Hayes.
Yep.
Well, people like Publix. People know of Publix. Let's get people there. And then kind of building off from there.
Well, it's the Publix, and then you've got the greenways that start getting folks using there. So now as that development comes out of the ground, people are already familiar there. You're absolutely right. That is a great way to stage development, to get folks into it early on, to really sort of kind of sink the hook, get them comfortable with it, instead of having to feel like you have to grow the whole thing.
Because I feel like almost like having the apartment, like having sort of like a apartment living though, is a little bit tougher to get people in, because it's not like an entertainment. I feel like the entertainment aspect that Mid-City was able to do with theirs, and then now they're adding on these apartments and stuff like that. Get people like, I really love the camp. I really love Top Golf. I really love High Point. I really love X, Y, and Z. I mean, you can't name them all in one hand. Then they're like, I could live here. I could imagine. And then I think Bridge Street did the same thing. I mean, now they're adding all those things, all the apartments behind them as well.
Yes.
And the RCP, I think the Collins apartments right there off of University is building, and they're developing all of that land and then connecting them to the amphitheater, connecting them to Mid-City. And I feel like that area has really done it well. Yeah. Like you said, like they've really seen this model of getting the entertainment, getting these people in, and then hooking them with, you can do everything here. You don't even have to go anywhere. You have Trader Joe's. You can get your groceries here too. Yep. And is that kind of the whole, like, is that model now, was that first really announced used with Providence, you think? Or do you think it was really Mid-City kind of did what Providence did on a grander scale?
I think that's been a downtown model. And quite frankly, you know, they'll often call it new urbanism. It's really old urbanism. Okay. Right. I mean, this is the way cities have been developing for thousands of years, right? You know, always at the human scale, always organically, always with, you know, the community coming together to create infrastructure and sort of a framework, and then the business interest creating development within that framework. We're just sort of rediscovering it. There had been that weird period in the U.S. that was really kind of an anomaly, which was where we decided, all right, everything has to be driving, you know, has to be car oriented, and we sort of spread everything out, and now everything's kind of having that come back together. But you know, it's been done well by a number of folks in town, and we love to see that. I mean, again, that goes to those sort of live, work, play, or live, work, connect communities that are so important. That you know, not only can reduce pressure on driving, but also provide folks with more variety in terms of where they live. It's great. You're right. I mean, getting in those apartments and then having all of those amenities around you is a huge draw. You know, we love to see more of that.
I mean, so this is kind of the last question that I'll end with, because I'd be interested to see your perspective and what you're the most excited for. But out of all these projects, these things we've talked about, these things that maybe we haven't yet to talk about, or we didn't get to, what are 3 things that you're most excited to see here in 2023 finish up, or in the next year and a half, 2 years to finish up?
Wow, that's hard to narrow it down. I can pick something almost in every corner of the city. We're currently waiting on a kind of an economic development report for the Meridian Corridor in North Huntsville, running from downtown to A&M. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity for some redevelopment along that corridor that supports the Huntsville City school sites and the A&M and Drake along that corridor, and really starts to develop that corridor as a kind of a college town vibe to it. So I'm excited to see where that goes. I'm excited to see the Greenway Loop in South Huntsville get completed. I think that will be, you know, once that's fully completed, being able to do that loop is going to be, you know, an incredible amenity. I think the work that we're doing around transit on 72, running basically from downtown out 72, we're looking at probably on our next council meeting, adopting the first phase of what we call a BRT line for 72, which is a higher capacity transit route that can kind of support some of that development at University in 72. I think that's going to be, you know, an absolutely great project. It can be the first of a new type of higher capacity, more attractive, more comfortable, more efficient transit for the city. And then the last one, which I think is interesting, is out in the Cove area. I think a lot of folks out there are like, you know, why do we keep getting this kind of strip development? Why do we keep getting that? There's at least one project in the works out there where I think you're going to start seeing the kind of town center sort of community-oriented development that they've been really thirsting for. Something like that, I think, in the next couple of years is going to start to take shape out there, and I think it's going to help transform that part of the community. And again, that all goes back to the idea of, you know, we have to think about Huntsville holistically. Every part of the community has its own particular character, has its own particular needs. So there's not any one thing that we're doing that we can do throughout the city, but they all need our attention, and they all need to constantly be, it's a garden, right? You're constantly pruning, and you're fertilizing, and you're growing, and you want the entire garden to be healthy, and you want it all to be growing. And I think the direction we're going to see that in every cardinal direction are really healthy, thriving Huntsville.
Oh, well, thank you so much sitting down talking with me today. We talked for almost an hour.
Oh.
And so it's been great learning more about Huntsville, some of these stories, some of the developments. I think being on the outskirts, you see one perspective, but having you and your perspective inside it and seeing this grow is huge. I continue to look forward to the growth that Huntsville's going to have over the next few years and the part that you're going to play for it. And I'm excited. I think this is going to be something that I'll have you back on in a year talking about everything that's changed, because it's going to look so much different in a year to 2 years to even 3 years.
Yeah, I would be happy to.
It's going to be hard to even imagine this. But thank you again so much for joining me today.
Happy to do it. Thank you for having me.